So I'm joined today by two great panelists, Catherine Craven, who's the Chief Administrative and Financial Officer from Babson College, and Colleen Lubick, who's the Supply Chain Finance Lead for the Campbell Soup Company. So Catherine and Colleen, welcome to both of you. Really appreciate you offering to spend an hour with us, and I'm excited to hear about how things are going at both of your organizations. So let's jump into it. So to start, I want to cover a little bit on how the general planning process works at your organizations. So what did forecasting look like at your organizations prior to COVID? Was it a million spreadsheets across all the different departments being chased down, or a single technology platform that was centrally collecting and providing information, or some combination there? So Colleen, let's start with you. What was it like at Campbell's?
Yeah, so thanks, Pete. I'm really excited to be here today. So at Campbell's, we had what I would say is a traditional S&OP process, or not integrated business planning process, that was monthly, right? So it's a cross-functional sort of process where you get input from sales, get input from marketing and the consumption data, and then you put it through the supply chain, and you kind of come up with an overall finance view, both on a annual and a rolling sort of 18 to 24 month basis. We would meet, say, monthly to refresh the forecast. And then I would say quarterly do these deep dives, right? So I would argue in the CPG world, a lot of it was still internally based data, right? So while we used indicators for external based data, it was a bottoms up sort of forecast using what we had available to us, like shipments and or capacity internally. So that's kind of, I would say, high level how we did it. And the financials would follow all of the inputs from the commercial organization, whether it be marketing, sales, and supply chain.
Okay, great. Thanks, Colleen. That's helpful. So Catherine, over to you. How is planning different at Babson pre-COVID? And I'm especially interested in what aspects of forecasting are unique for a college compared to more of a traditional CPG type of business. Oh, Catherine, I think you're muted there.
Sorry, rookie error. After all this time, you think I know better. It's so interesting hearing Colleen's challenges because, again, from a college perspective, and you know this from anyone who's gone to college or you send your children to college, we have very limited entry points, right, by design. So we're not selling product, by the minute where, Colleen, you'd have to look and see what's changing day to day. In our case, our biggest problem was the question of attrition once we had already admitted the incoming classes of undergraduate and graduate students. And so, we're a business college, number one for entrepreneurship, 26 years running. We are in Wellesley, Mass. We're very small compared to some of these larger state schools, and that played to our advantage as well because we were able to be nimble. But really for us, it's the unpredictability, as everybody felt that way. The last quarter of last year, we wound up sending all of our customers home because of COVID and writing checks to their parents. So that was a cash drain for last year. And then the whole unpredictability of the summertime. And I know, Colleen, you must have faced this with operational management as well. But, how do you get the administrators? We were told basically stay home and don't utilize the scarce testing resource because the students and faculty that have to be on campus, as well as our health and wellness staff, really need that. So our forecasting, if you're the finance person like I am, is really unpredictable at that point. And what we decided to do is to take this in chunks because there was no predictability really to what would happen in the fall versus what would happen in the spring. And our business levers really are, is someone going to pay tuition? And if they're paying tuition, are they paying room and board? So the unpredictability of the government saying, hey, look, you can't have people more than 6 feet closer to each other kind of sort of crushes the whole idea that especially a lot of our upperclassmen love to live in like 3 or 4 person rooming groups. And that was impossible under the regulations. So there was a financial impact to that as well. So we're still in a very real time sort of looking at the spring based upon the fall semester. I will tell you, though, that people, our college students in particular, were very tired of learning from home, especially if they had younger siblings who were competing for broadband space with them. For K through 12 education. So they are willing almost, at the beginning of last semester, it's like, oh boy, I can't have 3 roommates. I don't want to come back. Now people are, their mindset is very vastly changed. So all of that plays into, those are the softer parts of what our forecast process had to change by, and we had to get people across the campus. What had been really a very stable cycle became a day-to-day question of, did someone, take a leave of absence, which is allowable, or did somebody, change their plans?
Yeah, that's really interesting, Catherine, and that's a good segue over to really start thinking about the impact from COVID. So, Colleen, back to you. Campbell's is lucky in that they're one of the industries that actually has seen an increase in business as a result of this whole pandemic, given the types of products they make and the fact that they're shelf stable, et cetera. Can you describe how you adjusted your forecasting process in the immediate weeks and months after COVID? Did you kind of throw out what you were doing before and start from scratch, or were you able to make some minor adjustments to it?
No, Pete, it's a great question. And if you kind of think about COVID entirely, Catherine, it's sort of funny, some of the concepts and trends you were looking at, I was also looking at in two different ways, right? We were looking at, families that were used to sort of a trend to have 2 people at home. Well, now they have like 5 people at home, 7 nights a week, 7 lunches a week, 7 breakfasts a week. And people just had to go buy food at the grocery store, which is something that even myself as a mother of 3 kids was like, I don't realize how much food we eat and how much I supplement our food with on-the-go eating, right? Whether it be apples or stopping at Wawa, which is a, regional sort of, for those that don't know, in the Northeast, it's a Sheetz kind of idea where you can grab a sandwich or you're grabbing cheese sticks, whatever you can to feed your kids when you're running the soccer games. That all came to a halt, right? And so what was interesting, Pete, I'll chunk it up into 2 different things. It was, we threw out the forecast because in the short term, at least in the surge, you had to throw out what you knew. Because as you think about Campbell's, for example, the trends were 10 years in the making. So one of the things as a finance person that was somewhat easy, or I want to say easy, but what you always look back to say is like, okay, within the broad macro sense, are the trends going the same way? And if your overall forecast had sort of held to what you knew is happening in the consumer space, know what's happening in the industry, as a supply chain finance lead, that was my number one gut check, right? Is my inflation numbers going the way I think that, the external market's going? Is my volume going the way I know the consumer trends are going? Is our labor sort of crewing strategy following all of those pieces? So does it connect? Well, that went out the window, right? Because you had to basically say, what is the basis? There really isn't one. And so what we sort of shifted quickly into is what we call tactical planning. And in the supply chain finance world, or I said the supply chain world, it's basically saying you have an IBP process where you're managing more long range planning, more sort of materials on like monthly, but we went into weekly crisis mode, which between, I would say, argue March when it hit to through June, really, we sort of met weekly on how are we going to prioritize what was going on that week? And how are we then going to take what we're seeing in the weekly data, which it was drastically different week to week, because I call it the evolution of COVID. When we sometimes talk to our CFO, he'll say, why did we make this assumption? I'm like, well, we made this assumption on April 18th, and we still thought we were going to be back in the office on May 5th. So that one went out the window very quickly, right? So as you think about how we're used to planning, we kind of had to throw it out. And so what we ended up doing was almost refreshing from the end-to-end supply chain weekly, not only our consumption data, which is what we think people are going to take away from the store, we had to figure out ways to refresh our customer inventory views and also refresh kind of what our suppliers and freight partners were going to be doing, because the way the pandemic sort of hit and COVID hit, it affected a lot of macro trends, whether it be consumers, labor, and then how that sort of flows through the end-to-end supply chain was quite massive, right? And I would argue it still exists because the surge depleted inventories, right? Mm-hmm. You can't get labor to then go produce. You can do certain things in the short term to go and fill that void, but now it's 9 months in the making. So in the initial 3 months, we moved from a monthly process to weekly, and we really did deep dives on what was going on in the moment. Now, as we've sort of 9 months in, we still have weekly check-ins, but those weekly check-ins are more around how are we pivoting on the next month or quarter, right? And what are those we're really trying to keep it to 7 to 10 key messages or key actions that we're taking away each week to actually drive a change in what we're doing, which is very different. If I think about the financial forecast previously. It was sometimes like, okay, well, how are you going to update your guidance, right? How are you going to sort of plan whether or not you're going to spend marketing in this month or that month? This is very much like, how are we actually going to go talk to our union, or what is the communication plan to our 1,300 employees at our large plant in Ohio, right? Based on what was going on in that space. Or, as I think about our freight broker, we have almost weekly check-ins with their executive management to figure out what's going on out there. So that's a massive shift. And with that, I mean, Pete, I know you'll get into it in future questions. Along with that had to come an immersion in what's going on externally. It's not so much what's going in the walls of Campbell, but what's happening to the people outside of these walls is where honestly the answer lies. And that's a lot. That's not a linear forecast, right? So that is very much like there's stuff going on in homes, there's stuff going on in the labor force, and there's things going on in raw material and sort of political spaces that we need to dive into, because that's the answer to the 18-month forecast, or that's the answer to how we're actually going to sign a contract in December with our major supplier on how that's going to play out over the next 12 to 18 months, right? We're locking into some things.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you bring up, because in my world, I've always, told our clients, well, we need years and years of historic data to analyze and figure out what's going to happen. And now after this, it's like, well, not that that's worthless, but it's much less valuable than what we often call high frequency data, and what's coming in on a daily or weekly basis that you really need to understand what's going to happen, right? So it's a really interesting point, and we'll definitely get into data in a minute. One follow-up there. So you talked a little bit about supply chain. There was obviously a big run-up on supermarkets right when this thing hit, and people are stockpiling and hoarding. Have you guys ever caught up from a supply chain perspective to that?
It's a great question. So we're actually in our monthly close process right now. And so I got an email saying, well, I thought we were going to be down in inventory more than what you're showing. And I said, well, hold on. It's a tale of a couple of stories, right? We are down in some areas. So for Pete, one of the things that you asked me was, we have two kind of channels, really, large. We have a food service channel and then a retail channel. So Campbell's is lucky in that, a lot of our brands, are in the retail space. So in terms of where the pandemic has struck, we're, I would say, easily able to scale up in the retail space, potentially easier than some of our other competitors, right? However, within that, we can't scale up to the extent that we've seen these trends, right? They've sustained 12 to 25% increases pretty much week in and week out since March. Our supply chain's not set up that way, nor is many of the other sort of supply chains. And so, as I think about whether or not we've recovered, I would say on the shelf, you're seeing us have healthy in-stocks, right? And so, we look at that weekly now, right? And that data wasn't something that we looked at weekly because we were always in stock unless we had a supply interruption. Now we look at it because that's the telltale sign onto what's happening in the customer warehouse, right? Because sometimes there's not a lot of correlation now between weekly orders and consumption, right? So people are continuing to buy at that 20% clip, but orders might be 45% or 50% some weeks. And you're like, why is that? And it's because we are still operating, both ourselves in the manufacturing space, our suppliers, and our customers at historically low depleted inventories. And if the way I say to our executives is, well, guess what? We've never in our 150-year history in Campbell Soup Company depleted safety stock completely. We did. We hit a point where we know there was no safety stock anywhere, and that's unheard of. So I believe the recovery, we believe the recovery is going to happen, but the recovery is much slower than we had thought. We thought this recovery would kind of happen now. We are still much, I would say argue it, 2 to 3 weeks below on our own end where we would like to be at this time of the year. So it's fragile is what I would say. I think the consumer's not feeling it yet, but any snowstorm or, in the middle of the country, if we get a sheet of ice coming up soon, that could, very much disrupt, I would argue, the supply chains in the future.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I don't know if any of us expected we'd still be in this situation, that we are now. But let me ask you one more follow-up, and then I'll jump back to Catherine. So was there anything you did that was a reaction to COVID that you feel was especially effective, that you say, wow, this is a great move we made, a great decision we made from a planning perspective?
Yeah, I would say two ways. I think, Pete, I think the first two things we did, which was really important, was The first thing, actually, I would attribute it to our chief supply chain officer in our division. So for everyone's purpose, Campbell's has two divisions. There's a snacking world, which is our Pepperidge Farm goldfish, Snyder's pretzels, late July chips. That's one division. And then I'm in our meals and beverage division, which is soup, sort of Pace, Prego, V8 beverages. Those are our big brands. So if I think about what we've done on our end, we have 3 large thermal plants. They're massive, right? I always call them the cities of our Campbell Soup plants. When you show up to them, they're some of the biggest plants that people have seen. We prioritize people. So I think, I know I talked a little bit about this yesterday in our debrief, but it may seem fundamental that you would, but I don't know that every company did this. And our supply chain officer in our division was very much like, what do our people in our manufacturing and warehousing sites need? And she prioritized that. And that was brilliant because similar to all of us on this phone or on this call, the world, not only did the world disrupt our business, but it disrupted our lives. Everything we knew what was going on was thrown out the window. I had 3 kids knocking on my door during a conference call, like with the CFO, and I'd be like, what are you doing? So I call it like the pendulum of before I would be like, get out of there. Now I'm just like, oh, you see a child in the background? That's fine. On the front lines, that's a lot harder to adapt to. So she prioritized, do we need childcare at our plants? What do they need in terms of, incentive? How are we going to flex our schedule and our crewing hours so that because a lot of people work in our plants, our families, right? And so the husband and the wife would both work at Campbell Soup plants in the areas that we exist. So she prioritized that. And I think that helped a lot because we saw engagement and people, and pride really come out of our plants, which was critical because when stress is high, you want people to come to work. And they did, and they showed up. They were safe. They accepted the masks policy that we implemented, which, for all of us, I don't want to wear a mask all day. They're wearing their masks. We moved to implementing our safety procedures pretty quickly. That allowed us to ensure we can produce what we can produce. The second thing I would say that we did really, really well was from an executive team, we sort of eliminated a lot of, I would argue, the busy work. We threw it out. We basically said, here are the 5 priorities. We're gonna focus on availability, right? Safety, and supply. And that really eliminated in the short term a lot of the noise that exists in the background. We didn't ask people initially to, plan the 18 months. We're going to move our strat plan out 6 months. We're going to move our annual operating plan out. We're not going to give guidance to the street. That really helped, I think, the team focus on what we need to do today to make it settle. And I think that was critical because if we didn't, I do think there would have been a lot of distraction and things would have slipped in the day-to-day. I know it for a fact in the supply chain that we would have missed if we were distracted with what we needed to do right now.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, as horrible as this pandemic has been, it's kind of forced us or been a catalyst to make some decisions that have been really good things ultimately that hopefully we'll continue with in the future. Okay, great. So Catherine, switching over to you. There's obviously been a huge impact on the higher education space, from COVID. So after this initial impact was realized and you sort of had your bearings, did you guys begin to create different scenarios based on, likely recovery or additional waves or, this third wave that we're kind of in right now? How have you guys handled that?
I think it's really interesting hearing Colleen because we run, we're also a food service provider. So sort of, and by the way, just as a mom of 5, almost everybody who was home for the past 8 months, your Campbell's chicken noodle soup, which just went away for a brief period of time. I said, this is unprecedented. This is are the locusts coming next? What could possibly happen? Right?
Careful, Catherine. We still have a couple of days left of this calendar year.
So I really appreciate it. But, we had a plan for everything from, especially today, we have special vegan population, special dietary population. So I was involved in the planning from the minutest part of our dining program to, how many people can get tested, at what cost will they get tested, bringing them back. And then once you get sort of a baseline, and again, if you count our students as customers, which I do, how do you say, okay, here's the package of things we can offer you to keep you safe. And by the way, we hired an industrial hygienist. And by the way, we've been checking on best practices from Europe and, we're part of all these groups to say, how do you keep people safe? but the dearth, and I think I was saying this to you yesterday, Pete and Mike, the dearth of information, right? Like there was just no information. In March, we're told masks aren't, important. By April, when you're going to look for PPE, it's gone. You don't even know what kind of mask is correct. You don't know how many you'll need. Like, will cloth masks work? For a while, the gaiters were popular, and then all of a sudden they were not, and then they were again. So when you're buying PPE for people, and when you're, these are all the variables. So then they say, okay, I figured out what that package of goods and services to get somebody through a COVID problem could possibly look like. Again, it could change. How many of them do I need? Who's going to show up? And so our biggest change to our business model was that, and I think these next generations are much more digitally aware than we are, but going online is anathema to a lot of professors. And so that was another major change to the business model. So that all of these things impacted forecasting for the short term. And then I think we're all in the same question about what the behaviors are going to be like coming back to what is a long-term scenario. How much of this is actually going to be comfortable to people to work from home or to learn from home? How much of this is going to be people revert back to normal afterwards? So I don't know if we know the answer to some of these questions.
Yeah. Are there any key drivers that you guys are looking at to try to figure out, or keep tabs on where this thing's going, or what's happening next?
Well, from our perspective, Babson's a very international college. 30% of our undergraduates are international. We had 117 students in China. So what we figured out we needed to do, because we just could not get them back. And at one point, I thought, maybe someone can call Bob Kraft and get his plane, go over to China, and as they drop PE off, pick up our Chinese students, or as they pick up, PPE, bring them back with them. BU, same thing. They have a huge international population. So just a lot of the local schools were very concerned about getting back our international students. And at one point, Europe was totally off limits.
Yeah.
It seemed very strange to me, but that was another place where we couldn't get kids back. So the online delivery became very important. So again, our whole forecasting has changed now because we're much more granular. Like we know now how many students we have from China that are undergraduates, where it used to be, okay, how many do we have generally? Now I know exactly in a deeper data analytics model, how many, where they come from, and, in the future, where the likelihood is that they can get here.
Yeah, that's interesting. So to follow up on that, I guess, we're 8 or 9 months into this thing now. We've seen the impacts for this past fall. What are you planning for fall of 2021 at this point? Are you thinking that things are going to be more back to normal, or still planning for more sort of fallout from the whole pandemic?
So the interesting thing about our business model, as I mentioned, is other than our graduate programs, which tend to be rolling, but for our undergraduate program, there's the process by which high school students apply to college is pretty much similar from year to year to year. And you don't open up like, oh, you can start in March. Like that just never happens. So the idea that there's sort of a rolling admissions, or there could be rolling admissions, but there aren't rolling start dates. So you can't deliver our product, even if it was fully online, at any other time other than September and January, say, for undergraduates. For graduate students, we're doing much more flexible learning. But for the undergraduates, I have to say for Babson, and this is a knock on wood statement, we're really blessed that the value proposition, and I know you have a lot of our graduates in KPMG.
Yes.
But a lot of our demands actually increased. And I'm not sure if this is because people see that they want to get a business education, they want to be able to plan. I don't know what that is. But we're seeing an uptick in applications. So in other words, for 2021, we've already gone through our first indicators for that cycle because the early admissions and early decision applications have already been in. And we're currently in the process of deciding who gets in. So we had an uptick. And I know we're facing some contravailing winds here. There was a birth dearth in 2008. So those kids are around to go to college, right? They're not here to apply. And then you have the COVID factor. The biggest question is the value of a college degree. I think COVID, and I've heard my president, Steve Spinelli, say this, has accelerated what was a 10-year market trend into maybe a truncated 2 or 3 year cataclysmic event for higher education. So luckily, our indicators are that Babson, because of our unique value proposition, is going to be in a different position than some of the other undifferentiated colleges and universities out there. We're going to see some real financial issues. And in Massachusetts, just generally as part of a working group the governor put together last year, because sudden closures of colleges is not a good thing for anybody. It leaves people high and dry. So there's the state of the Commonwealth of Mass, at least, has been really interactive with private universities to see what our financials look like.
Yeah, that's interesting. Good to hear you guys are in that position. So let's shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about analytics and the use of data, which is an area particularly interesting to me. So Colleen, let's start with you. Are there any kinds of data besides, your just prior year actuals that Campbell's is bringing into your forecasting processes? So anything unusual from other internal systems or interesting external data, anything like that?
No, listen, I actually think it's funny because we are going through our strategic planning process, which I laugh because the range of outcomes could be huge, right? So if you think about and similar to what Catherine talked about, but in a very different lens, is, there's what I call like the bubbling pieces or the downstream impacts of COVID that are simmering on the outside, whether it be economic turmoil, which we know will happen for certain individuals for lengthy stays of, potentially suppressed income or job loss, right? Which is unfortunate. And then there's actually things where I'd say I think there's swings that are going to help somebody like a food company. So one of the things we have built into every single, I would argue, demand model, which are very highly statistical models that our demand planning team use, is not only a comparison to what we would call 2018, 2019 actuals, but we have these things to say, okay, well then where are the areas that we know sort of intersect with a trend? And a couple of trends that we prioritize, Pete, are we know we've tried the unprecedented trial. There's been unprecedented amount of trial of our products. We'd have to spend millions of dollars of advertising to get as many new users that tried our products this year as in the past. Some of them will stick. They will absolutely stick. Now, they may not be home 7 days a week, which I hope all of us are not a year from now. But there's a good chance that, the millennials, the Gen Zs that ate our product will eat it again. And they may have never tried our product pre-COVID, right? Because of different reasons. Choice models, right? Like there's tons of QSR restaurants out there that they eat. Catherine can explain, they have every option that they could possibly want in a college sort of setting. That may or may not change. So what we're bringing into is a lot of what people's eating patterns are. So what we would say is the trends prior to would be sustainable packaging, fresh, right? Clear packaging where you can see the food. Those trends I think are still very, very important. But the key question is like home cooks, the amount of devices that people have purchased on whether it be an Instapot or an air fryer, all of these at-home cooks, that we believe is not going to go away. So what we've done, Pete, is we have almost like a midline forecast, which has kind of, if you think about it, the trend hasn't changed on our business, but it is elevated. So it just kind of is like the line just shifted up in terms of, and what we're using, I think, for data analytics is before every financial forecast, we actually immerse ourselves in what I would say is the consumer landscape. So we do have our data scientists and our consumer research group in Campbell's, which are advanced in analytics further down in our finance, kind of talk about the landscape and the micro and macro data that we're seeing within the consumer space. So where we used to put consumers in buckets, which would be like healthy eater, wishful healthy eater, right? Like tasteful moments, like all of these different demand moments that exist in the consumer space, we've kind of shifted those now, right? And we now look and say, okay, within our growth space and our core business, how are we lining up against each of those? And there's very different data you will get if you use the external data and apply it to, say, 2019 base as an example, than if we use just the historical trend. And what we're doing is that's going to inform our investments, and it's going to inform whether or not we, sign a co-manufacturing supply agreement, because we may not have what we would say the right assets for where we now see our innovation platforms are going to go. So if you think about the data analytics, I would say definitely more robust, but it's also a lot more gray. So within that, you have to really make sure you're triangulating and picking the 2 or 3 areas that you feel are, there's a lot of areas you can choose, but there's those 2 or 3 areas that we feel like we're very well set up to continue to grow, but might be very different than what we did in the past. And so I think, if we just flip a deck, normally we'd start with the financials and our purpose. We are now starting with the consumer.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you mentioned a number of different types of data, and you mentioned your demand team has statistical models. Are you guys leveraging kind of more advanced machine learning models at all? And if so, have you had any challenges with getting user adoption of these things? I found a lot of finance organizations are very traditional, and they want to understand exactly how things work. And it's a little bit of a leap to get people to buy into some of those sometimes.
So, Pete, I'll give you one example, and it's somewhat painful in the role that I'm in. And I'll tell you why, because I sit in between, I would say, the business unit and the finance world. And if I had to talk about my job, 90% of my job, I think, is strategic business partner to our supply chain group. 10% of my job, which may or may not be true in percentages depending on the week, is rolling up the balance sheet, doing our cash conversion days, talking about those metrics in a very finance-oriented world. I believe we are very behind our industry, but also I shouldn't say very. We are not on the spectrum of using predictive analytics or using machine learning. We're not where we need to be. So one of the things that I'll talk about a very specific thing that's happening in real life would be our freight market. So we are seeing a very inverse relationship than we've ever seen historically in freight, right? And what's causing that? Well, the cost of freight going up is astronomical. And usually in times of economic strife, the cost of freight goes down. But COVID was the catalyst for this. And the major reason for it is because the labor shortages, that was a seismic bomb that went off in COVID to say, hey, labor shortage, which was always trending to being tight, is now horrible. So if you think about whether it's a truck or supplier, manufacturing or warehousing, there is not enough labor in the United States or in North America to fund the demand. And so what happens there is you have supply. Organizations park their trucks because they can't get labor. Mm-hmm. The bigger national carriers, which tend to be, the freight market tends to still be very fragmented, went out and started to say, okay, well, I'll give incentives. I will guarantee drivers $100,000 a year. There were some national carriers that did that if they come and join. But the turnover rate's 85% in the freight market. So you go and they set some national carriers set up trade. So what we're seeing is, I had to try to explain this in a very linear fashion to our finance group. So I talked to my boss one day and I'm like, I don't know how to explain it in a chart. It's not a table form. There is a bubble of things that almost like histogram of all these things that are happening that are resulting in this. How do I explain it? And, it's funny. He still shows me Excel spreadsheets. He's like, show me in 2 columns the sensitivity. I'm like, I can't, I don't know how to do it. It's 5 or 6 factors that if come together, you have one outcome. If these come together differently, you have another outcome. But the reality is what we ended up doing is kind of showing that in almost like a circle, is to say, listen, if these circles intersect, you're going to have an outcome of this. If these 4 sort of bubbles come together, this will be your outcome. But what was true, and I think we got there, right, visually, because the goal is to get it visually. You want people who don't live in this every day to get there quickly, right? I got it. There's labor shortage, trucks are parked, there's hurricanes in the south, fires in the west. And by the way, the wholesale market has completely crashed. So where you could use a Cisco or a McLean or these private fleets that used to be very geared to different geographic needs, the demand has shifted. It is now in the heartland of America out to the coast. We need a ton of capacity there. Doesn't exist. Drivers don't exist there, right? So how are we going to get that there? So I think we got there, Pete, but what I would say is where we need to get to machine learning a little bit is, how do you get to various degrees of outcome systematically using multiple inputs? And I think we as a finance group still want to use simplification. We have to figure out a way to simplify the complex, and I think machine learning can get there. So we're not there yet, but we are exploring what sort of supply chain system does that, because we do still have in our own supply chain a very stagnant planning system. One input, one capacity output, right? One inventory and working capital solution, where we really need 5.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it sounds like you've made some good progress. I find my role, half the battle of this stuff is only half the battle is the technology. The other half is, like you said, getting people to understand it. And, we actually have a role in our group at KPMG called DNA consultant that we put on all our projects, because you really have to almost translate some of the stuff or figure out a way of building that translation so people understand it and they don't feel like they have no control and it's some black box making these decisions for them.
Yep.
So that's really interesting. So, when we talk about data these days, I think the concept of cloud computing always comes up because having these applications in the cloud makes just accessing all the data so much easier and more effective to perform analytics. So Catherine, over to you. I understand that Babson recently has moved to a cloud-based ERP tool. Can you talk a little bit about your experience there, how that tool has impacted your finance organization and the planning processes, and whether you feel like you've gotten the benefits out of it, that people often hear about?
Sure. So I think when we started down this road, and in fact, when I first came to Babson 6 years ago, I was told higher ed, we're not in the cloud, so we basically had a system. I liken it to the, abacus or the stylus with a wax tablet, kind of back office function, because it's hard to justify spending tuition dollars on back office improvements, right? And especially like my key constituencies, student facing and faculty, don't see the benefit of spending several $1 million, to put things that used to be on index cards in someone's drawer into, an ERP system. But we've been at this now for 4 years, and thank God we did, because during COVID, I don't think we would have been able to even get simple things like our annual audit completed without it. Our data for the first time was all available remotely. Everybody could access it that needed to. And, I find it so fascinating what Colleen's saying too, it's the user adoption, right? Like to make sure that people understand that this isn't something coming for them, it's something that is a useful tool to help them. And, what we're also finding is that when it's done well, either people have to be reskilled or they need different, like job descriptions have to change, because basically any manual processes in finance are going away. These become automatic transactions, and that peak gets us that next level of being able to use AI in finance and predictive analytics and really manage better. I mean, we're a $217 million organization, so it's not that we're huge, but the idea of having predictability from what we spend money on, as I mentioned, a lot of things we do are very predictable, and it shouldn't be a shock or surprise when a bill comes in or when there's a demand for something that we're routinely used to doing. And I think, we're able to, during the pandemic, it was interesting to see the things we were able to spend money on that wouldn't have been prioritized in any other way, because the entire concept of a travel budget, which, kind of gets to, we do a lot of recruiting for students, recruiting for, donors. Those activities have been basically shut down since March. And what can we do to sort of enhance the student experience? So we used some of our data pulling together in ways that, every little silo of the college would think that's my money. We were able to use our ERP system to sort of ascertain what was not being utilized as much as it had been in years prior, and sort of gather that money back and use it for different things. So it's been a journey with our internal team, but it's really going to be the thing that is the future for us, so that we can get to that next level of predictive analytics, AI, and maybe having better, my governing board is a board of trustees, giving them the tools that they need in order to, plan for the long-term fiscal sustainability of the college is really important.
Yeah, well, I think moving to the cloud is always a journey, but that's good to hear that you feel like it gave you an ability to read machine learning and that kind of thing in the future. You touched on the organization and the people in your finance group and skills and things like that, which I think is an important topic. So I think there's a lot of awareness out there now that the finance departments need to really think about embedding and cultivating new types of talent and skills, who can work with some of these new technologies and new analysis techniques, right? Colleen, on your side, do you have any data science? You mentioned data scientists, right? But do you have any data scientists or these types of professionals that are actually part of the finance organization who help build models in newer programming language or work with some of the new tools and things like that?
Yes, Pete. So you know what? It's actually so we tend to be we're set up in a divisional structure where from the two divisions, right? Think of the majority of, I would argue, our finance support is sitting in the divisions, right? So instead of going up to the CFO, I go up to a president, right? Which is great, because actually that's the way we're structured. But we do have a hub and spoke model in some of these areas, and so where our data scientists sit, they actually sit underneath our CFO. And they sit, I would argue, right in between the IT and the finance space. So I work very, very closely with them. And what they do is basically where there's a need, we kind of put them. So one of the things that you asked about, how has COVID changed? Well, we kind of took what our data scientists were working on and put them against some supply chain work or the IBP process. And so as an example, we have about 5 or 6 professionals, and they use various forms, depending on what area of data we're working with. They'll, a lot of times reach out to external partners as well. We can supplement with consulting work. But they're definitely looking at, how do we digitize customer inventory feeds, right? Like that's a huge issue. Like today, we don't really, we do we call these old school imputed inventory charts where we believe this is how many weeks of coverage. But if our customers open up their data a little bit, like Walmart as an example, we can see it. And that helps us a lot because it helps us on rationalizing our SKUs. It helps us figure out, give our suppliers, you take cost out of the system pretty quickly. So they're working on models like that. And then we've done a ton of RFPs for what is that next generation of planning, our planning cycle, even though we put it in our planning system, 2015, 2016. I don't say it's obsolete. That's not the right word I would use, but somewhat not what we're looking for to move it forward. And so we are looking at various different programs, and they're helping lead that, because one of the things we don't want to be is the only one feeding with internal data. We want to be using the external data that we do have, whether it be customer point of sale data, customer back end DRP, warehouse data to inform our demand and supply programming. And so that's one area. And I think there's a whole nother area on how they digest the external information that does exist within IRI and Nielsen and compose it very differently than the way we've done before. And so I would argue those are the 2 main projects that I'm working on them with directly. And it's fascinating for me to see the world that the data scientists live in and how advanced, because I was sort of on the project team when we did our APO system, our advanced planning optimization system, 6 years ago, how far this has come. And I'm almost like, oh my gosh, I didn't even know you could get that. We need that, but the menu of options are huge. So focusing it on the 2 or 3 key areas is amazing, but we are investing in that. And we have, I would argue, invested in 7 or 8 individuals that are highly trained in the data scientist world internally. Whereas 5 years ago, we probably would have outsourced that, right?
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I mean, I think from what I see in my viewpoint, basically every function in a company now needs to have that capability, either part of it or an ability to tap into it somehow to really stay on top. Catherine, what about at Babson? Have you guys made any changes to the people that you're trying to hire into the finance organization or bring in to kind of elevate your capabilities? Yes. What's a typical new hire or ideal new hire look like for you guys these days?
So again, and I think this is true of a lot of places, hiring at some of the back office functions, like if we're not the star of the show, right? We're not faculty. There's a heavy recruitment process for the things that make the college attractive for people to come here. When you look at the back office functions, I think this is pretty universal. It's kind of like, how many local employees do we have? In other words, the process by which we hired was more governed by who's available in the locality than what skill sets we really needed. And I think, we're seeing as part of the COVID thing, I've got a lot of retirements in my world right now. People are like, I'm done. So this has been an opportunity actually for us that we can replace a lot of the old functions that were done sort of in a manual way. And we've always done it this way. And, I'll take a week to get back to you on a simple data point. These things are going to change because I'm going to be intentionally and strategically looking for people with the skill sets, like Colleen is saying, that have the sort of nimble and, the mindset acumen to think about things across, and that you're not just a sort of just taking in data without looking at it. And that's another thing that the migration to an ERP system, we're in Workday, has done, because it has eliminated the need for, and I joke about this, but if you're a fan of the movie Office Space, like the whole TPS reports, like I just have to get a report done to get a report done.
Yeah.
Does anyone use the report or read the report, and paper-based transactions, boy, that was interesting, right? You couldn't go back to your office for several months. And so if it was on paper, you didn't have it. And so the folks that rely upon that, it's like, give me back my paper. And that it's just not going to fly. So everyone's had to learn, I think, in this to think differently. But the situation that we're facing is I'm looking for a leaner, nimbler team because, quite frankly, I want those resources student-facing and faculty-facing.
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations are in that same boat of using this as a sort of an opportunity to bring in a new, maybe younger, type of person that has different skills and really, elevate what they're doing. Speaking about yeah, Colleen, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a question because I thought that was very interesting. Have you changed your curriculum at all for either A, finance, or B, business majors to incorporate analytics into it?
Oh, sure. So we just started, actually not 5 years ago, we started a business analytics master's program, and it's got an entrepreneurial, so it's like using your business analytics exactly like you were talking about for internal organizations, it's sort of taking the place of the MBA in a lot of ways. It's fascinating.
That is fascinating. I was just interested in that because, I was looking at some of, education for either A, you talked about retraining the workforce, and that was one I was thinking about. And I do a lot of undergrad recruiting at Campbell's. And you know what, it was interesting when you saw the candidates that have had a really good curriculum in whether it be data analytics or just colleges that have moved forward with those courses, they get things so much easier. And it was just, when I went through this round of interviews just recently in October, that was very apparent to me. And it just made me think differently. I was like, I wonder which universities have moved forward with it and which have not.
Yeah, it's been great for us.
Yeah. So we were talking about employees, which made me think about, the concept or the topic of kind of health and safety of these employees, right? Colleen, on your side, has Campbell's done anything to sort of monitor health and safety of employees throughout the crisis? And if so, how's it impacted your operations doing that monitoring?
That's a great question, Pete. So for many you can just imagine, right within our warehousing, within our plants, we're not, and you probably have seen it in the news, right? So there's some news in the meat world. Luckily, and we have bakeries, which are harder to separate people than it is on our thermal plants. Our thermal plants, for example, are our soup and sauce and beverage plants. A bakery would be Pepperidge Farm cookies and Pepperidge Farm goldfish. The plants are smaller, so people are closer together. So look, we have come up with a very strict protocol on what is the safety protocol in our plants, right? So mask wearing, obviously, separating where you can. Our engineering teams, which are usually work really closely to get those machines running, have alarms and buzzer, not buzzer on their bodies, but a buzzer to let them know when they've stayed too close together for a period of time, just to remind them, because behaviorally they're used to getting into a machine together and being like, okay, right, so they're on top of each other. We are very much we invested in a lot of different things, also plexiglass in our cafeterias, in our bathrooms. When they come in, they get their temperature taken, right? We have a quarantine policy where if we believe, we are asking people, if you believe you were exposed, please stay home. If you're hourly, you're going to get paid. If you're salary, you don't have to take a vacation day. Stay home, get tested, and make sure you don't have COVID so that you don't come into our workplace. And to date, at our manufacturing facilities, I would argue while we see absenteeism extremely high, some of that is due to self-quarantines, which we want. We have data that suggests, and actually this is another way we use data, that suggests the majority of our team that have gotten infected have not gotten infected in our plants, which is right, because look, people are getting infected outside of the workplace, and it usually is at home or social gathering. That's very good because what we're doing and investing is working. And then on the headquarters side, what I think we've done is, look, we are allowing people to work from home. I have not been into the office since March, which is kind of funny because my boss loves his binders. So I jokingly say, well, Bill, who's putting your binders together? He's still putting his binder together. I haven't used my printer since March. I don't even use it. I never use it. I get so mad when I have to actually mail something. So we are very different on the ends of the spectrum. He's like, well, how come you don't just print it out and read it? I'm like, I don't even know if I have ink in my printer, right? Yes. So within that, you've seen this, the pendulum of employees shift, right? But we've been able to successfully do it. And so on the safety side, Campbell's has a 4-pronged approach on return to work in the office, so that we have to hit some criteria at each of our office locations. And then only then we'll phase it back. So there'll be a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 return to office platform. And you know, if I just look
at that, come on, enough. You guys said patience. Nothing's defined for me. I don't want to start over again.
Oh,
I think someone's unmuted. That's
yeah. Okay. I think we're back. So Colleen, that's really interesting. Catherine, on your side, you know, I'm thinking you have both employees and students to think about, right? So on a similar note, are you using any types of data to track either emotional or physical sort of health and well-being of these folks?
Yes.
You know, how's it impacted you?
This is one of the most challenging things. Any college, you know, we're sort of in local parentis, right? And on a good day. And so, you know, the range of mental health, like I think back to when I was in college a long time ago, the range of mental health interventions that you see on a college campus now is very, very different than what was expected even 10 years ago. So I'll start with the baseline that's here. And, you know, what we're finding that, you know, certain indicators like Title IX, would you believe that it didn't go away? Even when people aren't together, there is still Title IX complaints. So it's been fascinating for us. We do have some external ways of looking at health and wellness, but you know what I think there's going to be a long tail not only on all of society mental health wise, but especially in this population. You know, we have seniors last year that worked so hard they had a 5-minute graduation online, right? They weren't able to be there, and you never get that time back. You never get that back. I think my daughter's a junior at Babson, and you know there's all sorts of stresses that are on these kids about the pandemic and what their work life is. So I feel that this is a great question, Kate. I've talked to a lot of data providers how I can track this better. You know, we're lucky that we have like these phones that we can outreach to kids and, you know, coming up with new technology, like how are you doing today? And without being so invasive that there's like this feeling of smothering, you know, students. So the traditional ways of monitoring this, which used to be very, you know, as of March, were really peer-to-peer, is kind of dissipated. And so what we don't know is, you know, if we open back up in January 19th for kids to come and move back in, what we're going to find, because we're projecting that we're going to have 400 more kids on campus than we did this past fall, which is good. And we want them back, and they want to be back, and they're psyched to be back. But then we're preparing for an onslaught, basically, of the need to be very much more attuned to their mental health needs. And it's a great question, because this is the future of America. This is our future workforce. This is, you know, we want people to be well adjusted. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we only got a minute or two left here. So I just want to end it quickly on understanding from you guys, what is the thing that you're most looking out for the coming year? So you've already talked about sort of what your thoughts are on the forecast for next year, but what is the one signal you want to have your eye on to monitor for if something changes? So Colleen, starting with you, what's sort of the number one thing you're looking out for that might change your forecast?
Honestly, the number one thing I'm looking out for is when things open up, even slowly, what do consumers and households do with their eating, right? It sounds silly, but like, I'll use my little micro house do we go back out every single week, or am I still cooking dinners 5 nights a week? I would love to keep doing that, to be quite honest, with my children. But whether it be realistic or not, I don't know. That will be the telltale sign if people are going to repeat. The other thing is, there's a data point that I look at weekly, is how many new users repeated on our products and how often. So if that repeat, the trial is super high. If that repeat is in that 30%, they are a heavy user. And in my mind, if you converted new users to heavy users in 6 months, well, that's the highest ROI you can have in a company like Campbell Soup. So that is the thing I look at weekly.
Yeah, that's great. Both those are those high frequency data points. And then Catherine, from you, what's the number one thing on your side?
So much of what we're doing is out of our control. So in other words, like, we feel that we've done a really good job of creating a value proposition for safety, in addition to everything else that has convinced parents and students that they want to come back to campus. So that's good. Question is there anything exogenous that's going to happen to us? Like, again, at what point? And I see in Massachusetts, at least, that we've gone from a 4% to 6% or whatever. Like, what is the number at which we get a call back from the government that they say, you know what, you guys, everyone's going home again? And that is out of our control. So that's the thing that keeps me up at night.
Yeah.
If we
Yeah.
get through 16 more weeks in the spring, that's really going to disrupt the next 2 years.
Yep. Well, that makes a lot of sense for sure. All right. Well, I think we're out of time here, guys. So Colleen and Catherine, I really want to thank both of you guys. I think this was a very interesting discussion for me, at least. So I really appreciate all your time and wish you guys the best of luck, going into the new year.